Well, Joe, thank you very much for speaking with me today. Now, you earned a Bachelor of Science First Class, majoring in microbiology and molecular biology. You went on to earn a graduate certificate in scientific communications. You then went on to an honours year investigating DNA markers in muscular dystrophy trials. You lectured science communication with the Australian National University. You've hosted children's science television shows on national television, and you've been a science commentator for the ABC. Now, all of that's interesting, but what I found particularly interesting as I began my research was what you called yourself, which is a veteran believer in the greenhouse gas crisis, 1990 to 2007. It sounds like an obituary. It sounds like you're memorialising a past life. What do you mean by that? What's the greenhouse gas crisis, and why do you end that at 2007?
For 17 years I was convinced that we needed to worry about carbon dioxide. I talked on ABC radio, I expressed my concern that we were going to get unstuck, that the climate was going to change in ways we were going to find very difficult to deal with. Absolutely, I talked about that. I convinced people as well. I helped raise funds for the Greens. I was very concerned. But having said that, there came a point where I could see that I didn't have much of a role in that debate. You know, there was a story, it was fixed, that kept telling the story. So I moved on to other areas and I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. But then David came to me one day in early 2007, and of course he'd been working with the Greenhouse Office.
Sorry, who's David?
David, my husband, David Evans.
Yep.
Dr. David Evans came up to me and he said, you know, there's no evidence for man-made global warming. And I'd actually been ignoring him for a few weeks because he'd muttered it under his breath a few times around the house, and I'd just ignored it. And he said that to me one day, and I said, you must be kidding. Of course there's evidence. Of course, what about the ice cores? That was the first thing I could think of. And he said, well, we know the ice cores and have known since 2003 that there's an 800-year lag between carbon dioxide and temperature. And I was floored because I read New Scientist every week. I thought I knew at least the big basics of this debate. And yet here was a point which didn't disprove it all on its own, but it was one of those crucial points that I should have been aware of. An 800-year lag that was well defined, had been around for 4 years, and which climate scientists wouldn't argue with me on. And that really stumped me. So I set about looking for evidence to support my belief that CO2 did matter. And pretty quickly I could see that most of this debate was not about actual evidence, but just about opinions. And when I looked for it, I couldn't find the evidence. So I pretty much switched in a few hours one afternoon, and then saw my role as being someone who had experience explaining science.
Right.
And that our side, science communicators, really hadn't done a good job at all with this debate, and we needed someone in there to explain how it would go. And how naive was I? I thought, you know, wow, when everyone knows what I know, in a few months it'll all be over. Like, it would turn out like that.
Well, that is an interesting point, because you, having been a key person in communicating so much about the orthodox view of the role of carbon dioxide and climate change, you would have had a lot of friends, a lot of business relationships, a lot of professional relationships with a lot of people. Were they interested in what you'd discovered? What was the response that you got?
Well, I've got to admit, I haven't raised it with a lot of my old friends and colleagues. Most of my work colleagues, they live on the other side of the country, and unfortunately the opinions are very strong. And as far as I know, I'm pretty much the only science communicator saying the opposite, and they probably have no idea where I'm coming from.
Okay, so you're a science communicator, but you're not a climatologist by training.
Not at all.
So what gives you the authority to stand up against such a widely held orthodoxy that is, you know, being promoted and held to be true by people with degrees in the very relevant scientific areas that we're talking about here?
I'm not telling anyone how the climate works. I'm merely pointing out questions which we can't get good answers for. Where's the evidence? We want empirical evidence, evidence that's observations. This is key to science. Not just climate models. We need more than that. And we need observations that come from things like weather balloons or soil sediments or corals or stalagmites or clams or tree rings. That's what evidence is, and that's what no one seems to be able to give us. And I've been asking now since January 2010 with very explicit, detailed instructions. People say to me, what do you need? What would change your mind? And I'm so like, I would change my mind back again if we found the evidence. But no one's been able to come up with that. And
okay, let me throw a few things at you that a lot of people would probably be sitting here thinking, well, this is, you know, here's some evidence. Ocean acidification, the increase in the intensity and frequency of heavy storms, extreme weather events, reduced ice coverage across the North Pole. There's a range of things that people would say, well, I've read these articles. These are published in mainstream mass media publications. Surely there's proof all around us. We're surrounded by the evidence.
Yeah, there's melting glaciers, there's rising sea levels,
Yep.
you can
All
the
of that.
rising CO2 levels, all of those
And
things.
you stand in the face of that and
Yeah.
say, what
We've
do you
got to
say?
be very careful about which evidence we look at, because it's a cause and effect thing. If aliens, as I joke, were warming the earth with their ray guns, the sea levels would rise, the ice would melt. So a lot of these things do tell us that the world is warming, but they don't tell us what's causing the warming. So the cause is really important. We've got to focus on that pattern, the fingerprint. What is it that tells us that CO2 has a big role? And I do think CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Right. I do think more molecules of it will add some warming effect. Right. My question is, how much?
Okay, so you're not so much questioning whether or not there's been a warming. The various reports that we've seen of various phenomena, observable phenomena that we've seen around us. It's more a question of why.
The warming's been going on since about the 1700s. It's been 300 years of slow warming. I absolutely agree with that. Don't deny that in the slightest. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. I don't deny that either. It's a question of how much, and the numbers really matter. And people say, well, it's insurance. We need to buy insurance regardless. And, the laws of physics, blah, blah, blah. But the laws of physics hide a really big part in this debate, which is that the models use the laws of physics for about 1 degree. Remember how they talk about 4 degrees of scary warming, between 3 and 6 degrees? All those big numbers come from the feedbacks, and the feedbacks are fed into the models. And feedbacks mean how the clouds change, how the humidity changes, how the ice changes. You get more ice, it gets more reflective. You get less ice, the Earth absorbs more heat. So it could get much worse. If the feedbacks were positive, the Earth might change in ways which mean we heat even faster. But those feedbacks are all things put into the models which we can't find evidence to suggest they exist. Not in a big net positive way. Right. The feedbacks are all there, right, but the sum total of those feedbacks, according to the observations we look at, seems to be slightly negative. They seem to be suppressing the effect of carbon a little bit, which makes it less scary.
Okay. You published the Skeptic's Handbook. Now, it's one thing to hold a personal view of skepticism or a personal view on the subject. It's quite another matter to put yourself out into the public and say, hey, world, here's my view. And in fact, the Skeptic's Handbook, it sounds as though you're trying to provide material to fellow skeptics.
Yeah.
That's you've taken a very strong, very public position on this issue, having come from a position where you were strongly and publicly supporting the orthodox view of anthropogenic global warming. Why did you decide to add your voice to the debate? What did you think you could bring that wasn't already being done?
To me, I could see there was a group of men out there, mostly men, but some women too, who were excellent engineers, good mathematicians, great with numbers, and they had these cutting arguments that weren't reaching the public. We won the science. It was pretty clear that any reasonable person would look at about the end of 2007 when we were in Bali. I was saying, yeah, we won the science, but the world doesn't know. And so for me, I could see a very serious role in there in trying to help the skeptics explain the few points that really matter, and to help the public get them to understand there was another side to the story, and to get the media to look at the other side of the story too.
Well, why wouldn't they be looking at it? I mean, this is a massive issue. This is a very, very serious debate. The implications are enormous. Surely the media would be covering all sides of the debate.
Well, look at me. I talked about it on and off, bits and pieces, for 17 years. It had never really occurred to me to follow the paper trail and ask the questions up until David asked me, where's the evidence? And I started to hunt for it. And I guess there's a lot of journalists out there who've just done the same. Look, they're all on schedules. It's really hard to keep up with all the scientific literature. They go to the local university that tells them one story, they give that story, there are hardly any other voices. And that's something I think was really important and missing, which I did after the Skeptic's Handbook, was talk about the funding, the way the government funding makes it difficult for one side of the story to be heard. All of the official positions, the official grants, the multi-million dollars, in fact $79 billion from the US government between 1989 and 2009. And I added up that number and I documented it, and it wasn't that difficult. No journalist had done that before. And put that number out there to show that there was massive amounts of funding to prove that there was a crisis. And, with good reason, we should have been worried, we should have been putting funding into that, but there was no funding to prove the opposite. There was no funding to say, well, show me the models are wrong, point out the holes and the flaws in this theory, explain why, say, the sun is more important, or the clouds are more important, or the oceans drive it, or something like that. And no one was really being driven by those kind of grants. So we had monopolistic funding.
Right.
And
couldn't that be explained somewhat, though, by the view that the science is settled? That debate has already happened. We already know that it's CO2.
Sure, and they tell us it's just like gravity, right? But with gravity, we understand that so well we can launch little orbital things and have thousands of them spinning above us, and we know exactly where they're going to be 5 years from now. We can predict that kind of thing. But with the climate, we can't predict things 3 weeks in advance. We can't tell you what next season is going to be necessarily, except sometimes the Met Office and others get lucky or do well. But let's face it, we know that they can't really tell us whether there'll be a barbecue summer next or not. Yeah. And so it's totally different to the settled science of something like gravity, which we have known and studied to the nth degree.
Okay, now I don't want to diminish your achievements within your own area of speciality, but you're not a climatologist.
No.
There are a lot of competing voices. You've got the IPCC on one side, who I would say are probably the central body of the orthodox view that CO2 and man-made CO2 is driving climate change. There are a number of other bodies full of very well-credentialed people who support that view. Then there's people like yourself and a minority of others who are coming out and putting an opposite view. It would be very, very easy to dismiss you as a crank, someone who's perhaps got some alternative agenda. The term big oil and money from big oil is thrown around, big business interests that might want to see the anthropogenic global warming theory get shot down. How do you respond to that?
Well, when Al Gore got his PhD in climate science, joke, I mean, as if nobody asked the other side these kind of questions, because they just point to the associations and whatnot. Now, most of the associations are committees. They never get their members to vote on a topic. So when someone from an association speaks out, they're not actually speaking for all the members of that association. They are just the appointed committee of 6 who volunteered often for the job and got selected to sit on that committee. So the association's endorsements doesn't mean anything like what the public tends to think it does mean. Then there are thousands of scientists who research something to do with climate science, but they've got nothing to do with the models. They start from the assumption that the models are right, they've never looked into the feedback loops, and they come, and then there's hundreds of thousands of researchers who are doing things on, say, lemurs in Madagascar, or spotted quolls in the outback Murchison, or something like that. And those researchers have never looked at the models. They assume that the modelers know what they're doing, and they come at this from, well, let's say this is right, then we'll follow up with this and what we've found. Sorry, I'm going to need a drink.
Jo, without wanting to diminish any of your achievements in terms of within your own area of speciality.
I'm used to it.
You're not a climate scientist. You don't have any climate-related degrees that I'm aware of. Your time in the media wasn't spent as a meteorologist or any of those sorts of things. And yet you're basically standing up and saying to organisations like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the various associated bodies, the CRU, a lot of very well-established, very respected university researchers, an enormous number of people with an enormous number of credentials, and you're basically sitting here saying that they're all wrong. So why would someone listen to you?
It's not me, it's not what I say, it's the questions I ask and the answers that they can't give which matter the most, isn't it? And in a sense, we're asking for evidence, and we've got very specific questions about evidence, and no one can provide them. You would think with all the billions of dollars in research funding, someone would be able to produce that graph, that evidence, to point to the weather balloons or the ice cores or the satellites or something that gave us the answers we're looking for, which is the ones that back up the climate models and the way they amplify what CO2 does. So our quibble is not with the physics of CO2, but with the way that's amplified in the models, the assumptions behind those. And they can't answer those questions, and we've been asking them now I've put it on my blog, a very specific question and post, and 160,000 comments on my blog, and strangely no one's been able to find that mystery paper with the evidence.
Let's talk about this amplification issue for a moment, because I suspect this is one that's going to come up time and time again as I interview people and talk to people. As I understand it, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, broadly speaking, doubling atmospheric CO2 will roughly equate to an increase of 1 degree Celsius.
Yep.
All else being equal, no feedback loops in a positive or negative direction.
Yes, you, me and James Hansen say the same thing.
Okay.
Yes.
The models, however, are telling us a different number. They're not predicting a 1 degree warming as a result of a doubling of CO2.
No.
What are they predicting?
They're predicting it depends, but between 2 and 6.
Okay, and why? How do they justify that?
They amplify it because the most important greenhouse gas is not CO2 but water. Right. And the idea is, as the world warms, and it makes sense, if you warm the world, the oceans warm and you end up with more evaporation, more humidity rising into the air. Now, we all know humid nights keep us warmer. Makes sense. Therefore, if we made the world slightly more humid, we might end up living on an even warmer planet. And that water amplifies the effect of water vapour or humidity, amplifies the effect of CO2, or at least that's the theory. But what we find, the other alternative is maybe the water rises off the ocean and evaporates more. But what if it turns into low clouds or medium clouds? What if it rains out? That isn't going to contribute to extra warming. We need that humidity to rise up in the high troposphere above the tropics to around about 10 kilometres, the level where planes fly. And if the humidity up there isn't rising, then it isn't having a net effect of extra warming and amplification. So it's pretty specific. We're looking for extra humidity in that area around 8 to 12 kilometres above the tropics, and no one can find it. They've been looking for 50 years, 28 million radiosondes, and they've searched with satellites as well. Satellites are not quite as good because they take a big band of the atmosphere rather than the skinny little layers that the radiosondes do. But radiosondes are not so common in the tropics. There are all kinds of things we have to do with evidence, but no one can find any evidence that says, yes, that assumption that's built into the models, which is crucial for about half of the warming that they project, there's no evidence to support it. And to me, this is a screaming story that ought to be told. And one of the reasons why we keep asking, where's the missing hotspot, which is crucial, and so the paper they can't find.
So that doesn't invalidate CO2 as a greenhouse gas. It says nothing on the role of CO2. It's simply the models are predicting a certain effect from CO2. Correct me if I'm wrong. And we're not seeing that effect.
Well, we're seeing the effects of CO2. Well, we don't know if we're seeing the effects of CO2. It's probably doing some warming, but the effect is so minor it's difficult for us to tell. I mean, it's very difficult to record the temperature of the whole planet and all the oceans and keep track of it. We've only had good satellite coverage since 1979. And we've got a cycle in the temperatures which goes up and down every 30 years. It's a 60-year rolling cycle. We haven't even got one whole round of that with really good data. So basically we're struggling on not very much data. But we have been looking since 1959 with weather balloons or radiosondes all around the world, 28 million sets of radiosonde data during the time when the world was warming seriously, from 79 till 1999. We've got millions of radiosondes telling us they can't find what the models are predicting. And you could write it off as just, well, models can't predict everything, they're just missing that bit. But that bit is crucial for amplifying the warming of CO2. That bit really matters.
I've heard it referred to as a blanket, essentially, that hot spot that is predicted in the atmosphere. Now, when you published the Skeptic's Handbook, in that you say that there's only 4 points that matter. It seems a bit of a stretch to boil such a big issue and such a big subject down to 4 points. But here are the 4 points that you say matter. Greenhouse signature.
And this has mattered to the debate in the sense that if you were a climate scientist trying to predict the climate, hundreds of points matter. But if you're in a public debate and we're trying to figure out whether we should invest billions of dollars in trying to change the climate with weather mills and wind vanes and things like that, then is it worth doing? There's 4 points, yes. So, and in terms of the data that we had then, the 4 most important points and the things I felt skeptics should be trying to talk about. The problem with skeptics is that we have got 50 points and all of them have their own favourite criticism, their own favourite reason and theory as to why the man-made global warming theory has failed. And I think that it's kind of divide and conquer. It's easy with skeptics because all of them have a different point and the public doesn't necessarily realise that there are a few that really matter more than the rest, which should be discussed.
Okay. So let's discuss those. Greenhouse signature. Is that what you mean with the hotspot that we were just talking about? Okay. Yes. So we'll leave that one alone. Interpretation of ice cores.
Well, to me, the big point about the ice cores is that temperature leads CO2 and it's basic chemistry. We understand why that happens. The oceans warm and they give up CO2. There's 50 times as much CO2 in the oceans as there is in the atmosphere. So the oceans, in a sense, are driving the CO2 levels up and then pulling CO2 back down. And this is, as I said, basic chemistry, Henry's principle. So to me, as having studied chemistry, I found that quite compelling and useful to know. One, it told me that the media wasn't giving us both sides of the story, which I had thought they were. And the other point is that the oceans are a really big driver in this. And that I-score graph is so compelling. I mean, when Al Gore put that graph up there and you can see temperature and CO2 in lockstep, you know, for me it was like, well, how can you argue? But of course, correlation is not causation. And as it turns out, temperature drives CO2 up and down. So there is a correlation in the I-scores, it's real, but it's backwards to what people think. It's not CO2 driving temperature up, it's temperature driving CO2 up.
Okay. A lack of rising temperatures you list as, this is the third key point that you raised in your Skeptic's Handbook. That would come as a surprise to a lot of people.
Well, at the time, the media was fairly monolithic in that it's warming, it's continuously warming, it's always warming, and there's never any change. And we were simply pointing out, again, it was the media not giving us the whole story, and also the models didn't predict it. So it's quite believable that CO2 could be warming the planet and something else is cooling at the same time. Sure, we could get periods of global flatness, and that does not prove that CO2 isn't having an effect. But it does prove the models were wrong, because none of the models predicted it. And so, yeah, to me, that was crucial. Something else was going on in the climate and the models didn't know what it was.
Yeah. So the lack of rising temperatures, again, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, the models allowed for potential periods of up to 10 years or so without rising temperatures, but to a high degree of certainty ruled out durations of 15 years or more. So we've reached a point now that we have had 15 years without a significant rise in temperature since, I believe there was a peak in 1998. And we've not seen those sorts of temperatures again since then. That we're reaching the point now where the credibility of the models is being pushed further than it's ever been pushed before. How are people responding? Are we seeing the scientific community questioning their own models, or are they? How are they responding?
It is finally starting that it is being discussed. I mean, Rajendra Pachuri talked about it when he was in Australia, and the IPCC and others are finally starting to admit that there has been a longer pause than what they expected. Although there are lots of ways you can disguise that if you put out the right press releases, and one of the ways you can do it is use modern models to reassess what the 1990 models would have said if they'd known what we know now in modern times and allowed for factors which they couldn't possibly have allowed for then. Right. And to me, that's always the kind of weasel word excuse you use when the models failed, well, categorically from 1990. We know those models have failed. They put numbers on it then. They've learnt not to do that. Now they tend to put ranges and broader things to give them more. It is hard to predict the climate.
Well, the weatherman is used as a metaphor for unreliability when it comes to any sorts of predictions. The power of a model to predict a future event obviously is the only thing that can actually validate a model. A model becomes validated once you actually can validate it with new data. Retrofitting a modified model over old data does nothing to actually validate it.
It helps though. It helps if you can do it.
Well, it may do, but ultimately, until we can actually see a model come out that then tells us what we're likely to see in the next few years and then watch it unfold in real time, surely any self-respecting scientist would recognise that until they can do that, their models aren't actually useful.
Well, this is the problem. They used to talk about validating the models in the 90s, but nobody mentions the word now. It's pretty much gone out of the lexicon of climate modellers. They just say the science is settled, the debate is over, give us your money. Not quite in that fashion. But.
Well, speaking of give us your money, you, after the Skeptic's Handbook, you published a follow-up, which you alluded to earlier in the interview, Global Bullies Want Your Money.
Yes.
That is a very, very strong title. It's a very, very strong way to announce your new publication to the world. This really, it's taking things to a new level. And you've gone from calling the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and other supporters of anthropogenic global warming theory wrong. You've gone from saying, hey, these guys are ignoring evidence or their theory's been invalidated and they haven't admitted it yet, through to calling them bullies and literally saying that they're after your money. Explain that to me.
Not all of them are bullies, and not all of them are, I mean, they're honest scientists. A lot of honest scientists have been dragged into this, just as a lot of honest journos who are perhaps just a tiny bit lazy have been dragged into this too. And my point with that is that there are people out there calling us deniers. It's just flat out name calling. There's bullying going on, the idea of shutting down the debate. And not only does the skeptics struggle with hardly any funding at all, mostly it's volunteer work that's risen up, thousands of whistleblowing volunteers who've risen up to say, hang on, something's wrong with this. And so, sorry, I've lost that completely.
Just talking about the Global Bullies Want Your Money and the justification for that title.
Yes.
Global bullies want your money.
Okay. The Skeptic's Handbook focused on the science to a great degree and the logic and the reasoning, Aristotelian logic and reason, because I want to get that back into the debate. Global bullies want your money is about, it's a meta, it's a description of how the debate's going and the fact that so much of it is dominated by pure name calling, and there's nothing about denier that is scientific. So anyone who uses the term denier to try and win a science argument, you know straight off that what they're doing is not science, but it's a form of bullying, name calling, silencing. A lot of people are scared of being called a denier. They just don't want to be called names. So they have doubts, but they stay quiet. Luckily, we're seeing that starting to break. And people are getting more confident, as you say, about just speaking up against it. But I would like to see the whole debate purged of this denier, name calling. And I try not to use the alarmist one, but sometimes there is no better word because they are trying to generate alarm. Let's face it, they can't deny that they want to alarm us.
Well, that deals with, I guess, the global bully part of that title. What do you mean they want your money?
Well, so much of this is a big gravy train, and we were on that gravy train in a way, getting money from the Australian Greenhouse Office. The idea
That's
being,
you and your husband.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, and the idea being that there are a lot of people who stand to gain money. Both sides of the question of there are vested interests, but there are especially a lot of disguised vested interests on the other side. And the renewable funds, the renewable investment industry chalked up something like $257 billion turnover in a single year, and that was 2011, I think. So that's $250 billion. That's a huge amount of money.
Most of that's government money that's being put into green energy schemes
A lot
and
of
that
that
sort of
is,
thing?
but
or?
some of it, for example, GE, good old General Electric, are doing the honest good work of producing turbines, hoping to make electricity. But they would not get their $21 billion per year, which is what they made on their renewables work. They wouldn't get that if governments weren't supporting it, weren't at the other end of the stick buying those wind turbines or putting conditions in and tax conditions and subsidies which helped other private groups buy them. So the private industry has been kind of co-opted by the government. It's not all direct government buying, but the government set up the conditions to make something which wouldn't survive on the free market survive, and it's worth billions of dollars. And so while we get called oil shills, thanks to no funding from any oil company, they kind of pretend to be greenies helping the planet, shaking tin cans and whatnot, when indeed there's huge amounts of dollars on the other side of the fence. $79 billion from the US government funded to find a crisis, and we pay for, you get what you pay for, as they say, and we got it. They found a crisis. And then there's the carbon trading market, where we're looking at $176 billion of money turned over in 2011. So it's a lot of money being turned over in these markets, and there's a lot of bankers, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Barclays Bank, you name it. They're all very keen for carbon trading because they're brokers. And being brokers on a deal, they make a little bit, no matter who buys or who sells or what the price is. As far as they're concerned, any market is a good market.
Every time something changes hands, they get their cut.
To be fair on them, they'd be crazy not to pursue this. They would be barking mad not to put up their hands and say, yes, please, we want a market to save the planet, but how concerned are banks about the planet, really? So, yes, the vested interests are enormous. And then, of course, there's lots of scientists who are doing good work, but they are funded under climate change grant banners. And everyone they meet in the tea rooms of the university says the same thing and believes the same thing. And I'm sure most of them really honestly believe in what they're doing and are doing a good job in their little niche. But no one's really paid to stand back and look at the big picture or focus on those few points like the upper tropospheric hotspot that really matter. It's like an error cascade. Everything depends on one point at the start, and everyone else has assumed that's right.
And so so many people are doing good work and hard work, but they were set off course from the very beginning.
Yes. Yes, science needs its opposition. It's just like in a legal case, it would be a sham trial if you didn't have a prosecution and a defence. It's just like in a free market. If you don't have businesses actually competing, it isn't a free market, it's a monopoly. Or we've had a monopoly in science, and it doesn't work in science either. We need people trying to disprove each other's theory. It's straight out of Karl Popper's falsification of science. We need people to sit there and fight it out and say, no, you're wrong because of this and you're wrong because of that, and may the best man or woman win.
Now, Jo, you've published the Skeptic's Handbook. You published Global Bullies Want Your Money. You mentioned to me before the interview there's some interesting story or something happened in, I believe it was the Skeptic's Handbook.
Well, back in those days, in 2007, no one admitted you're a skeptic. We'd do this funny dance when you go to parties or events like that, where you could see two skeptics would kind of sidle around a point, kind of doing a dance, slowly admitting stronger and stronger opinions until you knew it was safe to say, phew, I'm a skeptic too. And so back in that climate, it was quite nerve-wracking to release the Skeptic's Handbook, knowing that it was going to be attacked every which way if I got anything wrong. And one of the great things about skeptics is that they just never let anything sit. So before it had even been publicly released, it had got into the hands of a helpful, friendly skeptic who sent it on, as you would as a skeptic, to Professor Andy Pittman. And behind the scenes, Andy Pittman was saying, well, it's wrong because of this reason, and sending it to him. And Jim would send it to me, and I would send my reply to Jim, who'd send it back to Andy Pittman. And I'd just like to thank Dr. Andy Pittman. He was very helpful in giving feedback. I didn't change much. I rephrased a couple of things slightly, but it made the Skeptic's Handbook better. But what a huge confidence booster, because I knew before it had even been published that it had been tested by someone who is one of those supposed climate experts who knows everything. And we had got to the bottom of the answer already about the missing hotspot and what the best evidence was that they had. And so that was good to get that before it was published, to test it.
It is interesting. People will always start with their best arguments, and I do note a lot of ad hominem attacks directed at yourself, directed at your husband, Dr. Evans, directed at a lot of people who have expressed skepticism, even not full-on skepticism, but people who express some degree of reservation or some degree of moderation in their response to climate change. What have you experienced personally in terms of the responses? I mean, coming out with the Skeptic's Handbook, coming out with Global Bullies Want Your Money, having one of the world's most read blogs from on any aspect of the climate debate, but particularly coming from a skeptical point of view as you are.
It is pretty vicious, but you take it as a badge of honour. If they haven't got a hate page written up about you, you're not achieving anything. So it's got to be good.
And you have hate pages?
Oh, we've got the desmog pages, absolutely.
Okay.
Because, yes, you wouldn't be a part of this debate in a big way if you didn't have a desmog page. And the Source Watch pages and other pages, full of errors, though most of them are. It's so you kind of learn to say, well, yes, it's good. And we try and correct as much as we can, but you just can't keep up with it. One of the first things that happened after I released the Skeptic's Handbook was a professor from a Canadian university who was coming to Australia wrote me a letter. It was condescending in the extreme, saying it's the worst piece of junk science I've ever read. Make sure you tell us that it was a satire. And if you don't publish that it was a satire, I'm effectively, I can't remember his exact words, but he was going to come and trash my reputation all around Australia in talking to media and educational circles. He was some professor of education. So I thought for a few days, and I wrote him back a letter quite carefully, asking him if he was really sure that he meant to send that letter from his work address, because I'd checked it for logic and errors. And as a professor of education, he'd made 17 mistakes of errors in logic, and including many ad hominem attacks, argument from authority and argument from ignorance. And I really felt that his university would not be impressed to know that he was doing that and using threats in order to shut down free debate. So he never replied, strangely. I never heard back from him again.
Can't think why.
No, but we had good fun with it.
Yeah. Now, just getting back to the nitty-gritty, a lot of people might think that arguing over climate change and so forth is a bit esoteric, a bit unnecessary. Let's just get on and do something, make the environment a better place. Surely it can't be a bad thing to be putting up windmills and trying to find better sources of renewable energy, these sorts of things. Is that a sound argument? Is there an argument in favour of doing something anyway, the insurance policy, so to speak?
No, well here, this will make their heads explode. I do what I do because I think it helps the environment and helps the poor. I think the most important thing we can do for the environment is look at the data and use really good, rigorous scientific methods, and not climate models which have got assumptions, which produce results we know are wrong already. So what we need for the environment is good data, good information about what's going on and what matters. We need to consider all the parts of the question, including the fact that CO2 acts as an aerial fertiliser. It's a rate limiting step for a lot of life on Earth. It helps plants grow and we have more of it. So there are benefits and disadvantages, and we need to know the costs of both. And this idea that we should do it because it's insurance, that comes up all the time. It's just crazy. If you had a $50,000 car and someone said the insurance for it for a year was going to cost you $50,000, you would be barking mad to say yes, please. I mean, who would spend that much money on the insurance? Well, we're in a situation where we could spend more on the insurance that it will cost us. In fact, this is the core part of this video, isn't it? The idea that the insurance is far more expensive than any of the damages we're likely to get. And absolutely, it's a false argument, and there's no principle in science, a precautionary principle. There's no law in science that says that it works both ways. And I'm afraid for poor kids in poor countries who desperately need the energy so that they can store their vaccines in refrigerated units, and their meat and their food, and they can get clean fresh food and clean fresh water. And the sooner they get cheap, clean electricity, the better. But what does clean mean here? Well, I think clean means we remove the particulates and the matters from it which we know cause damage to health. But CO2, it costs us so much to take that out of the energy. We're denying them the kind of quality of life that we consider to be basic and essential.
So where do emissions trading schemes, carbon trading schemes, the Australian Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, where do these fit into the scheme of things then?
Well, unfortunately, they're enormous vested interests, and it's got nothing to do with the environment. And these big schemes, the big financial schemes, they're not going to help the planet. Firstly, because they're not having much effect on emissions, and secondly, because emissions themselves don't have much effect on the climate. But the emissions trading schemes they're diabolical. They are so big, I mean, in terms of $176 billion in funding turning over last year. It's a massive amount of money. And the aim of it is to buy air over China, which has less CO2 in it than it might have had if they hadn't cleaned up that factory. And so we're basing a whole marketing scheme on something which, for starters, it's a ubiquitous, universal molecule. It's crazy to think we can do a free market, a true free market, on a molecule which is universal like CO2. It's just not possible. I mean, cats, dogs, mice, cars, bacteria emit CO2. They're not paying for their deal. There's loopholes in this from the beginning. Then there's the loophole of how do we know whether the people in China would have cleaned up that factory anyway or built that dam anyway. So it's a market based on intentions. And that's just so prone to fraud and corruption. And if there are sharks out there in the financial world, they're making a beeline for the carbon market, or they were. It's a bit of a dead dog now, but they were making a beeline for it because it's so easy to rip it off. And so it was attracting, unfortunately, as well as good people, attracting those who could see an easy dollar. And the Italian mafia was busted for being involved in wind farm scams, I think, earlier this year in Italy. So it was just a market begging to be exploited, and it was.
So you've seen the economic modelling which underpins the whole of the 50-to-1 project. This idea that we can now demonstrate, accepting the IPCC's figures as a starting point, we can now demonstrate exactly what you were saying a moment ago, that the insurance policy against climate change is as much as 50 or more times more expensive than the actual cost of climate change itself. What are your thoughts on that modelling? Firstly, in terms of does it mesh with what you know to be true from your own research and your own independent validation? But also, what are the implications of that in terms of how we should respond now that we can put numbers on this?
The numbers do. The numbers fit with everything that I've seen and read. I have never seen a reasonable reply or criticism to those numbers that doesn't involve name calling or ad hominem attacks. So as far as I know, those numbers are very accurate and as good as we can tell, even for the hypothetical case that the IPCC is right and we know they aren't. So yes, I mean, it's a great argument. My only fear with the economic argument, as brilliant as it is that we have to win on the science too. And to me, this is really crucial and why I keep fighting on the science, because if we stop this because it was economically crazy, which it is, we would still be letting science go on with these faulty monopolistic funding models where scientists are only exploring one side of a question, the side the government wants them to explore, instead of looking at both sides of the question, which is what we really need to do. And the country is so much poorer for not having accurate science as fast as we can, and for not putting money. When I see that money put into emission schemes or wind farms or solar that could have been used for, say, leukemia research for kids. I see kids who are on waiting lists who might not make it through the next 10 years, that perhaps if we shifted our funding, maybe if we shifted our funding and put it into medical research, we might have been able to save them. So in a sense, we don't know who these bad decisions will kill, but we can be pretty sure that we could save some people if we shifted our funding priorities to things which have evidence to back them up.
And just in closing, are there any other areas that you'd like to cover, things that you'd like to put forward before we finish up?
How long are the piece of string? So, gee, that's a very open-ended, difficult one.
Is there anything that's come out recently that you know, it might be good to put forward before it's become widely known, before it's become public? Any updates to anything that you've perhaps had in your Skeptic's Handbook or in these various other publications?
Yeah, that's really interesting. The Skeptic's Handbook, written so long ago when I was so new at this game, there's very little that I would change if I put it out again. A few things that I would edit, but not much. So we were very careful when I put that out. And as I said, it was very useful to get it reviewed by as many people as I did to make sure I didn't make any mistakes in it. So it's good. No, I think we're at a really interesting point in the debate now where things are swinging our way, and partly that's due to cold weather. I hate to say it because that obviously is not a scientific way of winning this debate. I would much rather we won it on the pure science and on the graphs and the data and a sophisticated public debate. But what really scares me and what I think is most important about this debate and so many others is we're just not getting good polite debates. The manners have disappeared out of the debates now, and it's just resorted to name-calling every which way, and that's so damaging for public policy in so many ways. So many millions of dollars are wasted, and people have worked hard to pay their taxes, and to see the government just pouring them down the sink. What we really need more than ever in the media is good investigation and people with good manners who are really discussing the point. And so in a sense the debate has shifted on. Back in the start we were very much arguing the science, but when it became clear that it didn't matter how many ways we won the science, what we needed were ways to win the debate, just to claw back into the public debate. Because to me it's just remarkable. I've never seen anything like it, this whistleblowing revolution of thousands of scientists online, and a lot of them are retired and older guys. And when you think about it, you know, if you were an engineer, a miner, a statistician, a computer guy, and you've retired, you can do bowls or bingo, or you can download graphs from NASA and you can blow holes in them, and which one is more fun? I mean, the stimulation there from these guys. And so it's great to see what they've done on the internet, made this hobby out of pulling down official graphs and finding holes in them. So I just see my role as trying to help that work and that research be translated into a way that the average person understands why that graph matters and why it's important and why, gee, you know, that's really interesting. How come that wasn't put out by one of our big agencies?
Well, Jo, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you very, very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Good on you, Topher. Thanks for coming.